It's lesson 4, part 3. So we've done most of the heavy lifting today. We've come up with our data model. We've created our model classes that include navigation properties. So we've set out these parent-child relationships between our different models. And then we've declared a DB set object for each one of our models in our data application DB context. We've then created a migration and updated the database, so we now have all of the tables that we need in the database. So you'll be doing this in your assignment, but you only need to create 2 models with a single parent-child relationship between them. You'll then declare them in your application DB context and create a migration and update the database to build the tables. So now the fun part. So now we're going to try creating actually, let's see here. What do we want to create? Let's create a controller. So I'm going to right click my controllers and I'm going to add a controller. Help if my little toolbar would go away. So I'm going to add a controller. Now, when we created a controller before, we used an empty controller. This time, we want an MVC controller with views using the entity framework. So it will have actions and razor views for creating, reading, updating, deleting, and listing entities using our data context class. So I'll click Add. And now we get this little window. It says, okay, what model do you want to use? Let's use our category model. The next option is which data context object. So I'm going to click it. We've only got one. This is our application DB context. We want to generate the views. And if this is not checked, this use layout page, if it's not checked, you'll click this little ellipsis here and browse to views shared, and we'll pick our layout. So all of the views that Visual Studio is going to build, there's going to be 5 of them. They're all going to use the layout template that has our header, footer, CSS, and all the rest of it. We'll click OK. And it's going to give it a name automatically of categories. And notice it's plural. So it takes the single model name, pluralizes it, and adds controller on the end. So make sure you choose the same options that you see on my screen. I'll leave it up for a minute before I click Add. Once you've picked the category model, the application DB context class, and our shared layout, click the Add button. And Visual Studio is going to build a controller. It's also going to build 5 views for us. And those views will be used for adding, reading, updating, and deleting. So it's using this scaffolding, this auto code generation for us. And you can use this in your assignment. So now it opens up my categories controller. So let's have a look at what's here. There's a constructor. What kind of object does our constructor take as a parameter? So whenever we instantiate our categories controller, what's being passed to this controller on line 17? Right. Okay, yes, and Adam, in kind of plain English, what does this do? Why does our constructor take an instance of our application DB context? Why would our controller need that class? Right, because the methods in our controller are all going to need a database connection. So whenever we instantiate this controller, it's automatically going to receive an instance of our database connection. And it's going to call that underscore context. So what else is in the controller? Well, there's a method here called index. What do you suppose is happening here? When the index method gets called, what's this going to do? This code I've highlighted on line 25. This code is new. You haven't necessarily seen it before. What do you think it's going to do? Right. It uses our database connection class. It's using this categories DB set, right, that we declared here, that can be used to query and save instances of type category. It's going to convert them to a list and return the index view and pass it that list. And really, you're right, it's going to show the content. Well, let's have a look at this index view that the scaffold created. So if I scroll down to views, notice we've now got a category subfolder. This wasn't here before, we just created it. And I've got 5 views: create, delete, details, edit, and index. So if we open up the index view, what do we see at the top? This should look familiar from last week, right? We have a model declaration saying this view receives a list, an IEnumerable, of type category from the controller. And then it builds an HTML table, and in a loop, it displays each category along with edit, details, and delete links. So let's try this out. If we add the categories to the end of our URL, whoops, I'm gonna have to start my server again. Not sure what happened there, but just start it again. So now I'll add categories, and it's not case sensitive. And it's going to load that index view. So there's nothing here. There's no data because our database is empty, right? We just created this table. If I click on categories and choose select top 1000 in Management Studio, we're going to get an empty query result, right? We have the table, but there's nothing in it yet. Right? It runs it, no IDs, no names. However, we've got this link here that says create new. Notice the URL it's going to go to. I click it. It calls categories/create, which then opens this form. So let's try putting in a category. Put in any kind of category you want. Remember, this is a liquor store, so I'll put in beer. And let's see what happens. I click create. Now it takes me back to the index method, and now I've got a category here. I can create some other categories. Wine. So the controller is actually fully functional. We didn't write any code, right? I can also go in and edit. So I have a typo here. If I click edit, notice the URL goes to categories/edit and passes in the category ID. So if I make a change and save, my update works as well. Let's try the delete. Say to be deleted. I'll click delete. I get a confirmation page. Now it's gone. So I haven't had to write any code for doing create, read, update, and delete. There's no SQL commands. And if I run the query again in my database, right, we can see I've now got these three. So let's look a little more carefully at some of the code in our controller. Adam and Murillo were right that the index view fetches all of the categories from the table, converts them to a list, and returns them to the view. We have two create methods. There is a get method that returns the create view. So if I click create new, right, it calls the URL categories create, which returns the view called create, which displays an empty form in the browser. If I fill this out and submit the form, it then executes the post version at this same URL. So get displays the form, post submits the form. So it's got this HTTP post attribute here. It also is validating that our request is not coming from an external domain. And what happens here? It's binding the ID and name from our form to the ID and name in our category model. It says if the model is valid, add a new category, and then it calls save changes. So this commits the change to our database. And then we are redirecting back to the index. We've then got get and post methods for editing. So the get method will look up the selected ID. Actually run this with a breakpoint and see what happens. I'll start my debugger. We can watch the code execute when I click on any category for editing. So I'll go back to my list. I'll click on edit. So it passed in category ID 3. And we can see how Entity Framework will work with the database. First, it says, is the ID null? No, it's got a value of 3. So it's going to take my ID and it's going to call find on the category DB set. It's looking for ID 3. So it calls find, and it finds a matching object with the name of tequila, no products attached yet. So you can also see the navigation property of the model, right? If we have any tequila products, they'll also be fetched as part of our query. Then it checks, did our query return anything? Yes, it did. So return the view called edit and pass it this category. So I'll just continue. And this way our form loads and the name is pre-filled in here in case I want to modify it. So all of this code is fully functional. Now it's not perfect. It's not exactly production caliber, but it does work. Now there's one other new thing in here I should point out. Notice here on the get, it just returns an iAction result. So we've been working with this now for a few weeks. We've seen the iAction result interface before. Usually it returns a view. We said last week it might also return an HTTP error, like up here. It might return JSON, or it might return a redirect. But some of these other methods, like our index, notice instead of an iAction result, it's got this wrapper around it. It says public async task. And here we've got async in our query. Has anybody seen async before or worked with asynchronous code? Any idea what this means? Okay, you've done it a bit in JavaScript. So what does the async part do? Right, thank you. Yeah, Adam, you're on the right track. Connor, that was the word I was looking for. It's non-blocking code. So we can have other code running on this process at the same time if we want. It doesn't actually allow us, Eric, good guess. It doesn't in this case allow the page not to reload, but it means this code, if we're doing other things at the same time, this code won't block it. So for example, if we want to do multiple things. So do we really need this to be asynchronous? In this case, no, it doesn't have to be. So I could, if I rewrote this code, you don't have to change yours. But if I did this, if I just made this return an iAction result and did this without the async, without the await, this would still work fine. So by default, the scaffolding does run the methods asynchronously for better performance, but we don't have to write the code that way if we don't want. So this would work the same way. But I'll just leave the asynchronous code here. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to rename the brands controller and the brands views. I want to scaffold two more controllers, a brands controller and a products controller, because then we can use those to start populating our store. So I'm just going to I'm going to right-click my brands controller and choose rename. I'll just call it brands controller old. And it says, do we want to rename all the references to this? I'm going to say yes. So that way, the class name also gets changed to brands controllers old. So we're not going to use this one anymore. I'm going to do the same thing in the brands folder under views. I'm going to rename it to brands old. And now we're going to scaffold a brands controller with views and a products controller with views. And then we can populate some brands and products in the database. So we don't need to write any code for this. So I'm going to come back up to controllers. I'm going to right-click the folder and add a controller. I'll pick the same option as last time. Controller with views using Entity Framework. Our model this time is going to be the brand model. That's all I need to choose. All the other options, they just default from the last time. Our application DB context, our shared layout page, and it's going to be called brands controller. So I'm going to let this run. I'm then going to repeat the process to create a products controller. And then we can use the code that gets generated to populate some brands and then some products into the database. And then the last thing we'll do is I'm going to push this code to GitHub and publish it up to Azure so that the site is actually live on the internet. So here's our brands controller. It gives us the same methods: index, details, create, edit, and delete. And again, we get a series of a folder called brands with the same 5 views. So I'm going to repeat that process one more time, this time for products. So I'll add a controller with views using Entity Framework. And this time I want the product model. And Visual Studio will automatically name it Products Controller. All the rest of the options, they're going to be exactly the same. So I'll click Add. We can then use the code in the controllers and the views that this generates, again, to start populating our product catalog a bit more. We'll put a few brands in, and we'll put a few products in. So now I'm going to come back to my site. First, I'm going to call So now we get this empty list, and I'm going to repopulate the brands we had here. So I'm going to click on Create New. And I can start to create brands. I'll put in Molson. And our validation still works here. So if I try to put in a brand with no name, right? These validation rules we added last week, they still apply. So now I've got 3 brands. I'm going to put in a couple of products. We can add more products later. So you can add in any brands, doesn't matter what values you use. Now I'm going to add in some products. So again here, our index view shows a table. But here's the neat thing about how the scaffold works. When I click Create New, notice down here, it automatically gives me drop downs to pick a brand and pick a category. We'll have to fix this up later. So I'll put in the name of Canadian. Say a price is, I don't know, $42.95. We've got 1,000 of them. I'll leave the image for now. And I know my category ID 1 is beer. We'll have to fix this, but we'll do that next week. So now I can create a product and tie it to both a brand and a category. We'll add one more. So I'll add 2 products that both belong to the same brand and the same category. So how do you suppose Visual Studio is smart enough? And if I go to edit, notice it selects the right option. How is Visual Studio smart enough to generate these drop downs here? How did it know to do this? We did something in our code that told Visual Studio, hey, there's a relationship here. Right, Chris and Jason. Because in our models, right, we look at our brand, we said every brand is a parent to a list of products. And we said every product has a parent reference of brand and category. So with these navigation properties, when we auto-generate the controllers and views, Visual Studio will give us the parent options in a drop-down. So that's why these references are so important. Without these references, we wouldn't get these drop-downs being created automatically. So that's all the work we're going to do in here for today. Now, does this need cleaning up? Absolutely. We didn't put any validation on here. We've got to fix this so it shows the category names. Some of the labels don't look very good. Brand ID, category ID. You know, we want to format this as currency. The page title just says index, which doesn't make any sense. We'll clean a lot of this stuff up next week. We'll also look at customizing some of the design, which I know is something several people mentioned they are interested in seeing how do we do that. So next week we'll work on customizing what the scaffolded code gives us. Yeah, that's right, Bugra. So most of the work really goes into the models. Once you've figured out the relationships and what your database diagram looks like and you build your models, everything else is super simple and fast. So the last thing I want to do, I'm going to push my changes to GitHub, and then I'm going to show you how to deploy it from GitHub to Azure. So we don't need to use FTP, we don't need FileZilla to deploy our site. So I'm going to go back to my Git changes. So it shows I've made 26 changes. So this is lesson 4, part 2. Which would be scaffold, brands, categories, products. So I'm going to push my changes up to GitHub. And then once that's done, I'm going to sign into the Azure portal. So you don't have to do this with .NET Drinks, but you need to do it with your assignment. But I'm going to go through the process. So even if you want to create it now, you can try it and then you can delete your .NET Drinks. So I'm going to go to the Azure portal. And I'm going to create a new resource. And what I want right here is a web app. This should be the third option in your list. So I'm going to click on Create. It wants me to pick a resource group. I created a resource group for .NET Drinks last week that contains the database. So I'm going to put the web application in the same group. And then we have to give it a name that's going to be a subdomain of Azure Websites.net. So I'll say .NET Drinks .azurewebsites.net. I want to publish from code, and I have to select my runtime stack, which is, for me, .NET 5. I'm going to let it run on Windows. I could leave the region as Central US, but I'm going to pick the region closest to me, which would be Canada Central. And I'm also might change the size. I want to make sure I'm using the smallest size possible. So I'm going to click on change size and see if there's anything smaller than a standard. Yeah, I want this. I'm going to click on, this is the smallest production load, but this is just a development. So I'm going to pick dev test and pick the F1. It says it's 60 minutes per day and it's free. And then I'm going to click review and create. So it's setting up a new website that's running on the free SKU. And I'll click create. It's going to set up a site that's designed to run on the .NET 5 stack. So this will take a minute to deploy. And then it's going to open up the resource. Now, we could publish this directly from Visual Studio to Azure, but that's not the recommended process. We want to use something called continuous deployment. And some of you have probably heard the term DevOps before. Continuous deployment is part of the DevOps process. So the idea is, rather than deploying directly from code to the server, we deploy to version control first, and then from version control to our web server. So it says my deployment is complete, gives me a go to resource button, which I can click. So now I've got this empty website running. It'll load in the overview tab here. And it gives me the URL right here, .NET-drinks.azurewebsites.net. If I click it, it's going to load this URL, and it gives me this kind of setup page. It says, okay, cool, your service is running. So next step, deploy your code. So that's what we want to do. So I'm going to go over here on the left into the deployment center. Now, I have the option to use FTP like we did in our PHP class. Gives me a username and an FTP host I could use. But we want to look at using continuous deployment from version control. So I click on Deployment Center. And we want continuous deployment from GitHub. So the way continuous deployment works is if we connect our website to a Git repository, every time we push new version to GitHub, Azure will check every 60 seconds, it'll check that repo on GitHub for a new version. So this way our source code changes automatically update our website. So I'm going to choose GitHub. So again, I went to Deployment Center, and then in this dropdown, I'm going to select GitHub. Now, I've already logged into GitHub through Azure, so it already shows my GitHub username. When you do this, it's going to prompt you to log into your GitHub account. So you'll have to do that first. But that credential is going to get saved, so you only have to log into your GitHub account here once. So I'm going to pick my in front of the net account. And then it says, okay, what repository do you want? Which is I can start typing .NET Drinks. And then it says, which branch do you want to deploy? Well, I only have one branch. So I'm going to deploy the master branch. It's asking me to confirm that our stack is .NET version 5. And then I'm just going to click Save. So Azure is now going to connect to this repository on GitHub. And now if I click Sync, I'll say OK. And now it's going to try. Let's see if I go. They've changed this around a little bit. So if I click on the logs, it's saying my deployment is in process. So Azure is reaching into this repository in my GitHub account, and it's copying the code and installing any of the dependencies. This takes a minute or two to run. When this is done, our .NET Drinks site, I should be able to load it here. And then I'll show you how the deployment works when I make a change. Dismiss all my notifications, but still saying in progress. I don't think it's finished yet. No, not yet. We'll just have to be a little bit patient. Doesn't typically take too long. If we make changes, I'm hoping that they should deploy a little more quickly than the initial deployment. So once the site's up and running, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. I'll make a small change in my project, push it to GitHub, and then we should see that Azure should automatically pull that new version. Okay, so now it's running the deployment. Did take a little bit. It took a few minutes to set it up. And this log will update. And if there's an error, it'll show us what the error is and why the deployment fails. Okay, so now it says, okay, your deployment was active. And now here's my .NET Drinks running live on the internet. Right, I can go to brands. I could create something new. Right. So now my site is working live. I can edit data. And we can delete. So how do I make changes to this? I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. I'm just going to change some text on the home page. So notice here, if I go back to my home page, it just says, welcome, learn about, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to change this text, push my changes to GitHub, and in a minute, we'll see that if I refresh my live site, the changes should take effect. This is the last thing we'll do today. So in here, I'll say, welcome to the .NET Drinks Liquor Store. The site is built for Comp2084. I'll just put on a brief description of what the site is. Nothing fancy. So now my local version, the homepage has this new message. And if I open my local version and click on home, it now says this, but my live version on Azure, it still has the default text. So I'll go to Git Changes, say L4 update 3, update homepage text. So I'm going to commit and push, which is going to upload this change to my GitHub repository. Okay, I'll say pull and push. Didn't think I'd have to do that. So if I refresh my deployment log here, automatically at 148, Azure sees the change and is redeploying the site. So the previous version is active for now, but when this finishes, the new version should be active. This also lets us roll back. So if we publish a change and it breaks, we can just go and click on an earlier version and redeploy an older version. So there's backup rollback protection here. So once this is done, the latest deployment will say active, and this one will no longer say active. I'll refresh my page. Not done yet. So it does take a few minutes to sync a new version, but it will happen automatically. I didn't have to click sync again. Azure automatically grabs the latest version. I believe it checks every 60 seconds. Is running a little more slowly than I'm used to. Just close a couple windows while I'm waiting. I don't know if this is because I'm on the free tier that it's so slow. Shouldn't usually be this slow. Okay, so finally now, it did take about 3 minutes. It says the new version is active. Notice the old version no longer says active. And if I reload my home page, this text is now changed. So by backing up our code and archiving it to GitHub, we're automatically publishing updates to Azure as well. Of course, this is only going to work if your database is running on Azure. So for your assignment, you'll need to do this. Make regular commits to GitHub and create an Azure web application that is deployed from your Git repository. Okay, so I've recorded this whole process. Yeah, this is the way that modern cloud apps are typically managed. You can read more about DevOps on LinkedIn Learning if you're interested, but continuous deployment is a big part of that. Okay, I know we covered a lot today, but today was a really critical class, right? Because we can't really do anything else moving forward until our application is properly connected to our database. But the scaffolding of the controllers and views, the ability to deploy through GitHub makes life super easy for us. I know it's a new process. You may have some stumbles. That's fine. Feel free to send me an email, ask questions. If you need help, I will publish the recordings a little later today. Okay, are there any questions before we go? I'm also just going to stop my web server for now so that it doesn't use up all my Azure credits, because I don't really need to leave it running right now. So if I refresh, it stops. If I want to turn it on, I just press start again. Okay, folks, so all our code from today is available for you on GitHub. Please keep in mind if you use it, it's connected to my own database. You will need to replace that with your own database connection. Everyone should be using their own database. All right, that's all for today. Have a fantastic week. I will see all of you for our last class together next week, where we're going to work on customizing what we get out of the box from Visual Studio. Okay, have a fantastic week. Should be a beautiful weekend. I will let you know how the jalapeno lemonade tequila beverage goes. See you next week, everyone.